Well, thank you very much, Josette, for those kind and exaggerated words. 实在来讲，我所说的中国话是越来越差，多多指教。中国有一个传统的说法：天不怕地不怕，只怕陆克文仍然说中国话。And for non-Chinese speakers in our midst this evening, that is simply a saying that ancient China has a great saying, which is, there is nothing on heaven to fear, there is nothing on earth to fear. There's only one thing to fear, and that is Kevin Rudd still speaking Chinese. 首先，我要特别承认中国国务院参事工作学院总部的总干事。国家汉办主任徐林女士。Don't worry, I'm not speaking Chinese for long. I'd just like to acknowledge our distinguished guest from China, Madam Xu Lin, who of course is the chairman of the National Chinese Institute for the Teaching of Chinese Studies, as well as the person in charge of the Confucius Institute General Office, as well as a counselor with the Chinese State Council. 其次，我要感谢那个 Joseph Sheeran， 他就是那个亚洲学会的会长。今天晚上他邀请我到这儿来发表演讲。And thank you, Josette, for your kind invitation to be here this evening to make these remarks to our friends at this conference. 我要感谢那个美国大学会的会长 David Coleman, who is here this evening as well, who is President and CEO of the College Board of the United States. But in particular, 尤其我要感谢在座的老师们。因为你们的责任是更重要的，比我更重要，比别的官员更重要，因为前途在于你们的手里。But in particular, I want to acknowledge and thank and honor all the teachers who are with us here this evening, because your position is much more important than mine or anyone else who comes from the official class, because the future really does lie in your hands. 但是还有一件事呢，就是关于中美关系的未来呢，你们老师们所起的作用就是一种桥梁的作用。And the reason for that is that you are the serious bridge builders for the China-US relationship of the future. 这个关系呢，中美关系不就是对于两个国家很重要，对全世界也很重要，也直接影响到我们未来的全世界的和平、共同繁荣，以及我们全球的环保方面的、环境方面的、自然环境方面的秩序性。It's not just an important relationship for China and the United States, it's important for the whole world, because the future of our planets, peace, its prosperity and its sustainability also lies in this relationship's future, whether we have those things or whether we do not. 在这个重要的使命里面，你们老师们所起的作用很重要。你们就是未来，我们共同未来的桥梁。So to you, our teachers, I would simply say to each of you, in your great mission that you discharged, you are the bridge builders of the future. You are the bridge builders to the future. Josette kindly mentioned some things about my past. It's true I grew up on a farm in rural Australia, which meant I had a working familiarity with lots of snakes. It is true that I grew up in a small country town with a school of less than 100 kids and 4 teachers. And it's true that neither of my parents ever went to high school. or if they did, for a year or two at best. My mother was self-taught, my father was self-taught. My mother was in particular a student of the world. And she read and she read and she read. And she listened and she watched. And the story that Josette just told is absolutely true. I remember it vividly to this day, handing me the local Metropolitan Daily, which always arrived in our country town one day late. And with it, this large photograph, as you know it today, of the United Nations Security Council, with the Chinese delegate for the first time taking his seat at the table. And my mother, a simple country woman from rural Australia, said, "This is important for the world. Remember this day and think about it in the future." Of course, as a young kid in rural Australia, I didn't know much at all. But that piqued my interest. When I finished high school, I had not the faintest idea what I would do with my life. And whereas in the 21st century, Western school kids take what they call a gap year, for me that was simply an exercise in the safe and secure mid-70s of putting your thumb out and hitchhiking around Australia. Not legal now, not legal probably in America now, and dangerous then and dangerous now, but I did it anyway. I ended up in Sydney, and for the first time in my life, I met members of the Chinese community. If you grow up in a rural town, you don't know anyone from China back then. If you grew up in, if you went to the high school that I went to, there was not a single Chinese student. In fact, I don't think there was a single foreign student. But when I went to Sydney, I remember suddenly running into these families and small communities of Chinese folk living in that great city and becoming slowly familiar with the warmth of their hospitality, the importance in their lives of the centrality of family, the essential nature of community, and their veneration for an ancient culture. And very soon, I became deeply, profoundly interested in this part of the world. And when I left high school and finished my year of roaming around Australia, I went to the Australian National University to study for 5 years. 现代汉语,古代汉语,文言。我的文言很差。人之初，性本善，性相近。Chinese literature, Chinese philosophy, Chinese history, Chinese calligraphy, Chinese painting. I remember my Chinese calligraphy teacher telling me, as I learned finally how to hold the brush, you have to hold it in a way which it's under your nose, down to the table where the paper is, having ground your ink carefully, and got the ink on your brush onto the paper, as you would then, in perfect stroke order, execute the fundamental Chinese character, I, me, 我. And my teacher, who was a marvelously encouraging man, who I think had studied in Taiwan, said to me, "You know, Kevin," he said, "you are such an enthusiastic student of China. You work hard in the language laboratory. You are always in the library studying Chinese history. But when you do calligraphy, why is it that every character you paint looks like a collection of blowflies?" Blowflies are very big flies. He said, "I appreciate your love for China. Scrap the calligraphy." Of course, when I graduated after 5 years of Chinese, I applied to an institution I knew nothing about, the Australian Foreign Service, and to my great surprise, I was admitted as a career Foreign Service officer. And of course, in the wisdom of all foreign services in the world, within the first year, they decided to point me to Sweden, a well-known global centre for China. In those days, there was not even a decent Chinese restaurant in Stockholm. And then I finally arrived in Beijing. But in the intervening period, since then until now, when I have either been a student, a diplomat, a state government official in one of Australia's states, a businessman, a foreign minister, or a prime minister, and now, I hope, a simple citizen of the world. 现在我是国际公民，更安全。Is that China has been the common theme of my adult life in all things that I've done. And barely a day goes past when the things that I studied all those years ago at university are not used. Barely a day. Whether it's the language itself, whether it's the classical references which we saw on stage today in the performance of the great East-West production now called Cinderella, or in a knowledge of the common history of China's past or where it seeks to go in the future. In my discussions with President Xi Jinping, my discussions with Premier Li Keqiang, with members of the Zhengzhiji Changwei, to people who drive the cars when I am visiting some unnamed city or unnamed village in some province a long way from Beijing. This knowledge of China has for me been foundational. That's why I'm now at Harvard University. Harvard has asked me a very simple question to resolve, which is as follows. Number one, is a new strategic relationship between America and China possible? Number two, if it is, can it be sufficiently inclusive of the values and interests of these two great powers? Number three, if so, what the hell is it? What do we name it? How do we conceptualize it? How do we operationalize it? And on top of that, what does it mean for the rest of us who don't happen to be Chinese or Americans? 包括我在内. And so that is what I'm working on, and I believe the project is an important one for our future. Let me make a few general remarks before I yield the stage to others. When China very soon becomes the world's largest economy, it will be the first time since George III was on the throne of England that a non-Western, non-democratic, non-English-speaking country will be the world's largest economy. That's about 250 years ago. It's worth thinking about. If anyone thinks that that will happen without changes to the international and regional order, then they're smoking something. And it's probably illegal, at least in certain states. But my point about this is as follows. As of today, both in the US, the West, and the rest, there is a remarkable degree of ignorance about how China perceives the world. And for that matter, when I travel in Beijing, as I do all the time, there is still many Chinese misperceptions about how the rest of the world perceives China. Mutual misperception is a very dangerous thing in international relations. This year, we commemorate the centenary of the outbreak of the war to end all wars, the First World War. Narrowing the perception gap is important. It doesn't solve everything because sometimes there are conflicting values, sometimes there are conflicting interests, and they run hard up against each other. But narrowing the perception gap or the misperception gap can reduce the problem to more manageable proportions. Within that frame, let me quickly list for you, with no great commentary on each, what I regard to be the 7 great mythologies about China. And this is where linguistic and cultural literacy can help, and this is where the work which you good teachers across America in the teaching of this extraordinary language help as well. The first great mythology is this, that China is a single monolithic state. Anyone who knows China well, as I do, knows that there are many Chinas. Yes, the state does speak with a single voice usually, but the voices within China are now vast and diverse and more diverse than they've ever been in its modern history. And therefore, language and a knowledge of culture is a critical vehicle through which to understand the complexity and the diversity of contemporary China and therefore where it is going. Mythology number 2, that China intends to rule the world in the 21st century just as America has ruled the world in the 20th century. Some familiarity with Chinese history would tell us that China's preoccupations have been primarily domestic. That China, even when it had its opportunity to do so, during the Ming Dynasty in particular, to establish an overseas colonial empire, chose not to because they weren't terribly interested. They chose to make money instead through trade. Much more interesting when you think about it. And instead, China has focused its external engagements primarily ensuring that its borders were as stable as possible, leading it from time to time with conflict with its immediate neighbours, particularly to the north. But the idea that China has some long-suppressed imperial ambition for the rest of the world is, I think, a product of furtive imagination in the eyes and the thinking of some in the West. The third great mythology, that understanding China is impossible because the Chinese are by definition exotic, inscrutable, evasive about their real aspirations, or just too plain polite a society to ever penetrate. 我对于这个看法的答复是什么？胡说八道。And my response to that argument is that's just a load of nonsense, put politely. And the truth is, yes, there are cultural forms. Yes, there are cultural mores. Yes, there are complex social relationships. But these are no more complex than ours if we have any degree of self-perception about what constitutes the contemporary West and the component parts which make up for it, including the United States. The fourth great mythology is this, that China is fundamentally animated by considerations of wealth, power, and above all, face, 面子, 富强, 繁荣, 还有面子方面的因素. Of course, when it comes to wealth, power, and face, none of us in the West have ever been concerned about those things, have we? Oh, I'm sorry, it's just an Australian problem. My experience is, frankly, with a level of self-reflection, we in the collective West have also been concerned about wealth and power, and if we think about it, questions of face or social standing are not alien to our consciousness either. I think we need to be careful about throwing stones in glass houses. Number 5, the fifth great mythology, that there are fundamentally conflicting values between China, the US, and the rest. Let's look at the cardinal values of the West. They're often described in terms of liberty, equality, solidarity sometimes, perhaps even more recently sustainability, perhaps even security. And of course, if we argue that, do we argue that the Chinese people have no aspirations for liberty or freedom? They do. Do we argue that, in fact, that the Chinese people have no interest in the question of equality within their nation? They do. Does China have no sense of solidarity with people beyond its borders? China does. Is China now concerned about questions of environmental sustainability? It's come late, but China is. And so I think it's important that we reflect carefully before we conclude empirically that there is a deep fundamental conflict or clash of values. There are different values traditions. Anyone who is a student of the Chinese classical tradition will tell you. You look at the classical Confucian values, the hierarchical values of xiao, for example. Concepts of yi, righteousness, xiao, filial piety. Concepts of ren, benevolence. These do not have ready translations in the Western canon. But when we look at other values from the Chinese tradition, and one of them was reflected before from Lao Tzu, and the Taoist tradition, and the Buddhist tradition, and other philosophical traditions alive in China, which deal with harmony, with balance, with unity, 中庸, 大学, 平衡, these concepts are very central to traditions within Western thinking as well. And therefore, I believe we need to be very cautious before we reach conclusions about fundamental conflicts of even values. And then if we look at through a philosophical and historical lens, and we look at the classical traditions of China in the West and those of Greece and Rome in the West, it is important that we subject that to careful analysis as well. I find many things are in fact there to be discovered for us. The seventh and my final mythology is this. And this goes to the question of you folks who are teachers in the room. The great mythology amongst many across the Western world is that Chinese is just too hard to learn. Just too difficult. Enter a school somewhere and they'll hang their head and say, it's just too hard for you Dabizi to learn, okay? You big-nosed foreigners, you Yangren, 没办法, okay? You foreign barbarians, there's no hope. And by you, that's what we say to each other as foreign barbarians. Now, the truth is, any cursory familiarity with Chinese will tell you that if you're lousy at grammar, Chinese is the language for you. It's true. 从语法方面的看法来讲，是最简单的语言，对不对？ If you really want complexity, go off and study French and German. German in particular, if you've got a grammar fetish. That'll take you generations to master as a foreigner. Sure, the sounds are a little different, but if you can sing in the shower, you can work out your Chinese as well. What it requires, like everything else, is a bit of commitment and hard work, and being good bridges between West and East, between China and the US, requires hard work on the language. But if our kids are starting earlier and earlier, and even if they're not and they start at the age of 18, which is when I started, it is perfectly doable. And guess what? You can make it happen. And I conclude with this: to learn anyone's language, let alone the language of the country which is about to become the world's largest economy, is a simple mark of respect. A very simple mark of respect. How many folk in China now speak and study English? How many people in the West now speak and study Chinese? I don't know the numbers precisely, but I'm pretty confident that Chinese will win out in their study of English, as opposed to us studying Chinese. It's a mark of respect. It's a doorway to understanding. Recently attending a seminar in which President Xi Jinping also participated in Beijing. One of the seminar participants from the Chinese side said this, and it's stuck in my mind ever since. He said, referring to a comment from one of the Westerners attending this symposium on China in the 21st century, 中国21世纪论坛, he said, for the first time today, as someone who has been a career diplomat for China, and I'm in my late 60s, he said, I've heard a Westerner say, this is something we can learn from China. Think about it, Westerners. This is something we can learn from China. We're constantly saying, here's a bunch of stuff Chinese should learn from the West, can learn from the West, are learning from the West. And by the way, look at all our universities, they really are learning from the West. But put the shoe on the other foot. And as a mark of respect, not just for language, not just for culture, but in fact, a deep and profound civilizational heritage, including some of the new and innovative things which China is doing today, there might just be a few things that we in the West could now learn from the East. Humility, after all, is supposed to be a cardinal virtue of those of us in the West as well. To conclude, I could give you a long lecture as well about Chinese perceptions, misperceptions of the United States, misperceptions of the West, misperceptions of the rest. I leave that to another day. My purpose this evening is simply to say there is much work to be done, but you, the great teachers of this great language in America, are part of our vanguard. I thank you.